Okay,
I'm
it's officially recording. I don't think, oh, we may have a few attendees, eventually, but we're gonna go ahead and get started. One of the things, oh, Allison is an attendee, Don, she probably needs to be moved over. Dawn is moving over Allison Kuntz. She is our newest member. She replaced a member that had to step off. So I want to say welcome, Allison, and thank you for joining the Boundary Committee team. And everyone that's on the screen is a part of the team. As I transition off, I think if we have another meeting, by that time we'll know who the point person will be once I leave, but we have a limited time. One of the things that I hope everybody had a chance to review the information that Don sent out. We will have some time after Zach presents to answer any questions about that as much as we can. And then talk about the impact. But one of the things that this committee requested was to actually have some visuals of when you start to move the boundaries around, what that will look like as we move east to west, so that as we start a discussion around possibilities, what the impact could possibly be. I will say the things that Zach shows us tonight are just hypothetical scenarios. None of these have been adopted or recommended or to say that's what we're going to do. It's just to show like, if you do this, then here's the impact, to help us as a committee to have larger discussions around what do we think is the most feasible, sustainable, and to help us to accomplish the goal of balancing the schools. So with that, I'll turn it over to Zach.
All right, thank you guys. So I believe that almost everybody has seen the tool that I use in Tableau that we built out in Tableau to look at the boundaries and where students are located. I do want to share a little bit about the process that I shouldn't be unfamiliar to everybody in this meeting. So these are some of the slides from Kathy Johnson that she has presented to the Boundary Committee. She's presented to the Budget and Program Evaluation Committee. She's presented at the board. And so we look at capacity information. And this isn't the updated capacity information from our current change.
If somebody is looking, Zach, I'm just telling them, if you kind of hover on the left-hand side, in case you don't know, you can make the slides as big as small as you choose to, in case you're like, I can't see that.
Went ahead and blew it up a bit as well. So from this, we looked at the RSP report and we looked at capacity and where each building's capacity was, so that as we explore shifts in our boundaries of what schools can take on more and where to alleviate some of those pressures, we're really looking first and foremost at capacity. But there's other important things to consider here that I believe that we've taken into consideration as we've moved some boundaries with Kennedy, Prairie Park, Cordley, and New York. And so some of the questions that came up from those boundary shifts were around the number of free and reduced lunch for title programming, the capacity to take on additional students with IEPs, and ELL students were also another question that came up. And so as we shift these boundaries, as we're looking at those things, we need to take into account and attempt to consider the impact on the receiving building with regard to SPED, with SES, with ELL status. So I'm actually going to trim this down and stop sharing that PowerPoint. So given that, we then go to look at the boundaries. So typically I have both of those screens up at the same time, and not only looking at the boundaries, but we look at where the students are located within those boundaries. So let me zoom out here and take that back in. So as we looked at the PowerPoint of capacity, we see that Corley, which is now going to be have greater capacity. We still have Pinckney that is under 60%. We have Schwegler that's floating around 70%, and Woodlawn that's about 70% as well. Sunflower is also at 76%. So we do have some schools there where we're thinking about those boundaries and the students associated with that and how we can shift over. So some of the schools that really need some relief would be your Deerfields, Quail Run. Both of those have a high percentage, and then Langston Hughes as well is getting up there. But Quail Run in particular is already at the 95%. And so let me find the Quail Run boundary is right here. And so then we start looking at, okay, we need to relieve some pressure on Quail. How do we shift over to some of those buildings that I just mentioned that maybe have a little room? And then do we need to do 2 schools at a time? So we need to relieve from the neighbor school of Quail over to an additional school further east so that Quail can then move the next boundary over. And so with these scenarios, the school districts that are close, you have Sunset Hill that doesn't have tremendous capacity, but then you have Pinckney right next door. So moving some Sunset Hill kiddos over to Pinckney so that we can then have Quail Run students over to Sunset Hill. So if I zoom out here and look at where these boundaries are and who we're polling, well, that's the Deerfield. Quail, Sunset Hill, over here to Pinckney. The students that are on the border, actually the school is located we start drawing lines around the students that, if we want to take a subsection of students and draw that boundary and say, okay, these students are now crossing Iowa Street to go over to Prairie Park. So one of the other things that we ran into at the last switch was crossing 23rd Street, crossing those major intersections, and how that impacts the boundaries and what we need to do there. And so we continue to, these students are close to their neighborhood school, but could also go over to Prairie Park. You're still crossing Iowa, but it might be able to take this neighborhood down here, move it over to Hillcrest, which would then free up Quail Run to move into Sunset Hill by taking this neighborhood over here. So this is how we work through the scenarios, and we just keep getting our numbers down here to see, okay, how does that shift capacity so that we can continue to find the space as we move west to east. So it's kind of an overview of the process I go through. Are there any questions about that process portion of it? Seeing there is none.
Sorry, I have a quick question. So with that, is there kind of a proposal that's out, or a proposal that's currently being suggested, or no? Okay.
No, I do not have a proposal that's being suggested at this point.
Okay. And then I apologize since I wasn't at the first meeting, but I just wanted to ask, so with all the work that would be going into this and kind of redesigning the lines and coming up with a new plan, is there any current process in place so that we can verify the addresses or residents, I guess, for students at each school? Can we do that every year so that we can truly make sure that the boundaries, that you are truly within your boundaries for each school?
So I can answer that. We do verify that each year. We also limit transfers to certain buildings, but what we don't have is the resources to track down if someone chooses to manipulate the system. And that most districts, I've talked to a couple of other larger districts that run into that sometimes. The amount of time and energy that would need to go into that, and then there's sometimes unique circumstances that we may be aware of that others we can't disclose it. The number of people who are actually doing that is far less than if you shift the boundaries. It wouldn't have the same impact. In the cases of people who actually may be using a relative's address or something to that extent. But we do follow the look at our transfers and deny them in some of our schools that are closer to being at capacity than not.
And then, so on that note, with the transfer, is that by building principal, or is there a committee that does that? And then also, when you say you verify that, how is that verified or asked every year? I don't feel like maybe I've had to indicate. Maybe I put my address, I'm not sure. I guess is it just by address? Is it just people putting their addresses in and that's the
Melissa, you can answer that. I mean, Melissa is one of our principals, and so it does come back to the principal, but we also watch it and we'll tell principals we're not taking. So for example, West Middle School, we said no transfers are going into West. If there are unique special circumstances, we have direct conversations with the principals, but we say upfront before people submit a transfer, these schools are closed.
And then we verify through lease agreements or utility bills.
And I'm so sorry, I don't mean to keep. So is that, I feel like maybe I gave that in kindergarten and then I didn't have to do it again.
So you should have the opportunity to do that yearly in registration. And that's where I pull the information from, is from PowerSchool, our student information system. And so that is something that you should do annually when you register your kids. There is a place on registration to update all of your information.
And is that a required field? Am I able to skip that and not show a bill?
Unfortunately, too many parents do skip that.
I'll just go in and check.
Mm-hmm. But that should positively not be skipped, and we try our darndest to make sure that all parents accurately enter that information.
So I think what Allison is asking, and I think I can address it, is once you verify your address, like in kindergarten or first grade, when we do yearly registration through PowerSchool, we're not providing documentation to validate an address. We're just saying in PowerSchool that the address is in there is the one that I want the district to have, but there is no cross check for the district to validate that that is a correct. I'm not providing you documentation every year. I provide you documentation when I register my kids for the first time, But then every year when you ask me to re-register, I'm saying when I go through that process that that's the address I want you to have for me.
Correct. And I think that if you were to transfer schools and want that transfer, then you would provide that new information. But if you move but want to keep going to the same school, I could see where you would just continue to enter in Power School the same address that was originally verified so that you can keep attending your same school, even though it's incorrect information.
But then I guess my question is, then if you transfer like from 5th to 6th grade, and let's say you go to Deerfield, but then if your school that you're supposed to be going to is West, but then you want to go to another school, then you would have to verify your address, correct?
So all of our information, like all data sets are really only as good as the input. And so if parents are inputting incorrectly, then that is going to throw off all of, our models, and that stinks at the end of the day for us who need this data to make sound decisions. And so we're relying on parents to do this and do this correctly.
Would it be advantageous at all to put that as a requirement every year, to put that pay stub or bill or whatever it was that had my address and my name, so that that could at least be verification here? Just to keep me honest. I realize people are going to do what people are going to do. Maybe I was driving over the speed limit today. Maybe that happened. But most of the time I do the right thing. So I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. If we're going to go to this effort and put in the work, it would just be nice to have some verification that each year kids are where they should be.
And Allison, I understand and get that component, but what we find is probably 97%, and I think I'm shooting low, of our families are where they're supposed to be. And if we ask people to update it and be honest, but if your address has not changed in 12 years and every year you have to do that, that's not a common practice for most districts, and it would just be an extra step for those people who are not, that it does not impact. We typically know who is not at their correct address by a couple of things. When we mail out mailers, we get return to sender. The students typically tell us. So those things that we don't necessarily advertise that we're doing are how we typically find out who's not really in an attendance area that they should be. So yes, we could require every parent to do it, but those who are not being honest about the system, I would say is less than 2 to 3%. And then we would be making the larger community have an additional step. And that is something that the district could consider, but just based off of our experience over the years, that's what we find. And then I know in a school like a West, 1 or 2 additional students make a huge difference. And so in those cases, the benefit outweighs, like if everybody did this, we maybe wouldn't have had these 10 extra students. But when you look at just the demographic, like who lives in the West attendance area without those who are adding in, they're still over capacity. So you still would be facing the same challenge.
Anna, can you hear me? This is Kristen.
Yes.
Okay, I was just going to say one thing. I feel like I was just going to share exactly what you said. Our registrars definitely have a pulse based on information that they received on return mail, student information, contact information. If someone's not, if their address does need to be changed. And my only feedback I don't think our parent community, based on how much effort it takes to get annual registration done now, that it's all electronic, to provide an additional documentation, I think would really, I don't think we have the manpower at the school level to get that done, just based on how much effort it is to get it complete for all of our families through Power School right now.
I would second that exact statement. I was going to say the exact same thing, Kristen.
And just out of curiosity along those lines, so the parents who do what they're supposed to do, and at the annual registration, they enter in their new address where they've moved to, is there a mechanism on your end where you contact those families and say, hey, we see that you've moved, your new school boundaries are this school? Or do we just sort of assume that families realize that they've moved somewhere else and contact the
No,
new
they're
school?
contacted, and in some cases, it just, depending on the circumstances and the grade level and the capacity of the school may elect to allow them to stay there. So let's say if they're a 7th grade, the family moves in 8th grade, they update it, the school may say they've been here 6th and 7th grade, we're going to keep them. But once they update their address, that's where the registrars and those who are looking at it then say, here's your new school, or this is where they let the principal know or someone know, and they wrap back around to them. Yeah. So it once you're not in that attendance area, and I don't know if I'm using the right term, it does trigger something for somebody to say, hey, here's your new attendance, your school. Other questions? Just in regards to the process, because as a committee, Zach showed us like where there's room to shift and the things that we would take into consideration. So if there were specific scenarios that we either wanted to explore or see, that's when Zach can come back and say, let's say the example he gave of moving some Sunset kids to Pinckney. Is that what you said, Zach? So if you move some Sunset students to Pinckney and then you move some Quail students to Sunset, this is how many students would be impacted. This is how the classes would fall out, and that type of scenario. Or if we wanted to look at if we moved, because this did come up, this is not me saying it's a suggestion, but it came up when we changed the repurposed Kennedy. There was some communication or some consideration around currently the Kennedy ESL students this year, and the Prairie Park ESL students are at Hillcrest. So if you shifted them to Courtly, because as they come up, any new Kennedy ESL students will now go to Courtly, and that eventually will probably fade itself out because that's now their home school, which is an ESL school. So should we shift the Prairie Park students there because how the boundaries are and where those students go does that make more sense than them going to Hillcrest, which then would open up Hillcrest where students, Hillcrest is more centrally located. So there may be the Deerfield students can shift there and that type of, without even shifting the Hillcrest students, you open up space for some centrally located students to go into Hillcrest. So those type of scenarios, we could talk about, this is how the students will be impacted. This is how many students we could shift. This is what it will mean, and that type of thing.
I just have a question on the process. Will that any, I guess, decisions be based around trying to keep a feeder school model trying to keep a grade school that feeds directly into certain middle schools, or is that off the table at this point?
Right now, we haven't discussed anything for anything to be off the table. We currently, we would just make sure, we would have to make sure that our middle schools stay balanced in a sense. So for example, we wouldn't want to feed more kids into West because they're at capacity. When we look at how the elementaries feed into our middle schools, with the exception of West being like the largest now, Billy Mills could probably, have more students, but the capacity at Liberty Memorial, you can't get 600 students in there. So you have to just take into consideration what makes sense and how to balance it. But nothing is off the table, but we also wouldn't want to make a decision about a feeder pattern that would disrupt or cause one school to be even more overcrowded, if that makes sense. I think right now they are semi in a feeder system. Only 2 of our middle schools, when they go to high school, Liberty Memorial Central and Southwest split. And that goes back to the whole SES and trying to balance that, because if you have all or one to go to either high school, it significantly impacts what the makeup of the 2 high schools are.
And I guess was one of my concerns is my kids were at Quail, and coming from Quail splits to West and Southwest, and then Southwest splits again going to Lawrence High and Free State. So those kids get split and split and split. So just putting that out there as a concern or just a thought, if that can.
No, we absolutely can look at, so what we probably would look at is what would happen if all of Quail went to Southwest versus all of Quail going to West, because West is already the largest. So we can definitely look at historically why they split them, and then look at what happens if you send them all to Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
Great.
that nothing is really off the table. Big picture, we would just have to see what the impact is. So if that's something that we wanted to explore, we can definitely explore that.
It would be nice to be able to hear some of those priorities as we try to make things work. Obviously, capacity is at the forefront. And one of the things that we heard before was crossing intersections, main roads that we want to look at. Just things that we can consider as we're doing this that is at the forefront of your guys' minds. So outside of feeder schools, are there additional things that you guys would want us to consider?
This is Megan. I just had a kind of historical context question. And I'm certain that part of the answer is going to be it's up to the committee to a certain extent. Historically, how long have the rollouts of the new boundaries taken effect? Like, is this something that we would be generally looking at to roll out for 21-22, or is a boundary change we're looking more likely to be 22-23? What's the history in terms of how the timing usually happens?
So 21-22 is off the table because that's August. And one of the things that we would do is you have to communicate to the community so they all understand that. So anything that was decided by this committee, we would probably want to have any decisions for 22-23 by no later than January of 22 in order to plan and make sure the appropriate staffing and that kind of thing is occurring. So, I mean, ideally, that's what you wanted to have a decision made early for the next year to implement. But this late in the game, we would not, anything that we come up with would, because we've already allocated staffing, communicated to families, kids have already transitioned. So typically you want all of those changes to occur before those enrollment transition things start in like February, March, in most of our schools.
Thank you.
One consideration I would be interested in thinking about is just how can we balance the SES distribution between the different schools so that's as balanced as it can be.
So when you say that, I just want clarity. So Zach, because he can bring a couple of scenarios, are you saying balancing at the elementary, middle, or high school? Because each one of those are very different, because we have more elementary schools than we have middle schools, and we have more middle schools than high schools. So if you're talking about balancing at the elementary, you're talking about busing kids across town. We can definitely look at that, but I just want to know, do you want to look at it at all levels or a specific level? Because elementary balancing has greater, probably from my perspective, negative impacts than if you were looking at high school or middle school. Like, just because of the makeup of Lawrence, and Zach, maybe you can bring it so people can see it, just because of the way it falls out and the SES tends to be in pockets, you would, for example, if you want Langston to have a more diverse SES makeup, you're gonna have to bus kids from the more centrally located, and then you have to bus kids out of Langston if it's not room. Like, you're going to be doing some, because you got to make room for the students. But we can definitely look at that. So do you want us to look at that at all three levels, like a scenario of at all three levels, or a particular level?
I mean, I think eventually it would be good for our committee to look at it at all three levels, but I feel like last time we were kind of talking about just trying to focus on elementaries right now. I know that can have implications when we talk about the feeder schools and all of that. Yeah, so I don't know. I know we do kind of have like this neighborhood school model, which when we have pockets of, the neighborhoods are segregated by wealth in some ways. So I don't know. I don't know about the idea of busing kids across. I don't know how other people feel about that. But I mean, maybe we could just look at different scenarios and think about it, the pros and cons. I don't know.
I know one of the scenarios we had talked about very early on when we first talked about Kennedy was a single scenario of creating two grade centers, taking two elementary schools and making a K2 and a 3-5 grade center. And I know for me personally, I wouldn't mind looking at what the logistics of that would be to expand that beyond just two schools. I know that traditionally would fly in the face of the neighborhood model, but I'd be curious to see what that would look like, of how that would look if we spaced that out beyond just two schools.
Other scenarios? Zach, and then Zach can repeat what he has down. Our next meeting is June 17th, and I don't know, we can talk about time and how many scenarios per meeting, because I think any of them will lead to larger discussion. So I'll let, any other scenarios before Zach recaps what we have?
Anna, I was just going to share regarding the scenario of all Quail Run coming to Southwest, which was basically what we had when I was first principal, but we were too big. And so it went to the boundary committee to help relief. And so just with Langston and Quail both being big, we could be right where West is. So I think that's just thinking looking long-term projections at both Langston, Sunflower, and Quail's numbers. So, and that it's maybe just that's how it's going to be fluid to address the needs at the time. But
Yeah, and Kristen, I think if you look at, we can look at that scenario with moving 12 kids to a more centrally located, because then maybe that'll balance out the middle school, either west or southwest, if they all go, like just depending on how you relieve the elementary, because, and so I think running through those scenarios and seeing the domino effect, but I'm glad that you say that, because historically, we'll go back and create the same issue that we had previously, possibly, but things may have changed, and they're looking to see if those are the same families and the same kids, because that's one thing that some board members expressed, that they don't want to keep just shuffling the same families around.
I mean, it definitely helped us, but now West is definitely bigger. Yeah.
One other quick question kind of about the process. I know that our numbers are just going to be wonky this year no matter what, but because of the pandemic, but you know, as we're looking at these numbers and making these different scenarios, is there any reason to expect that they would be differently wonky in different neighborhoods, I guess? Do we have like some neighborhoods where we may have more kids who were going to private school or something, and I don't know. I was just kind of wondering, like, what would be the best way to try to get the best data we can, even though we know it's going to be a little bit weird this year.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's going to be weird this year, not knowing who actually is going to come back and who's going to go ahead and stay in their current learning model, either homeschool or private school, or maybe opting for Lawrence virtual school in that scenario. And so I think with any projections, well, I live by the motto that all models are wrong. Some are just more useful than others. And so we anticipate that portions of this model, they're going to be wrong. And we're just trying to make it as useful as possible. And so we'll do everything we can to identify the students that are remote learners right now, or that we lost from years past, and try to make it as useful as possible. Just understanding it's going to be wonky. And but every year it's going to be wonky.
Yeah, that might just be as we go into making scenarios, if we do have like a particular neighborhood where we had a bigger drop off this year or something, that might be helpful to know, like, this might have a bigger wild card in these numbers than in other neighborhoods. But yeah, I get it. It's just we're going to do the best we can with what we have. So.
So what I have a few scenarios here where, well, and maybe SES in the balancing portion of it isn't necessarily a scenario, but something we should keep in mind as we're shifting students around. Maybe it is a scenario, and we do look at what really balancing would look like. I know Castle is a dividing line in Lawrence, where east and west, there's more pockets on the east side than there are on the west side of Castle. And so looking at that, also looking at grade centers, and maybe more than just 2 schools, and setting up grade centers and what that would look like. Keeping in mind where we lost more students, so that we might know maybe where the model has a little more error involved in it than other areas of town. And so what I'll end up doing is I need to go around to each of these schools and I need to look at the classrooms to see how many rooms are actually available, and look at capacity in that sense, and then how many sections we can actually move around. So that this is a high level view that we did here, where I just draw the maps and then I go to the schools and actually see what's possible. And then that gives us a much cleaner idea of, okay, where can we actually make some of these moves? So those are the scenarios that I'll bring back after looking at the buildings and those rooms, and how many sections we can add, and then where those students are coming from, to give us a good idea of what each of these options can look like for us. Was there anything that I missed in there? Anybody that had a suggestion that they just didn't hear me repeat? Also feeder schools, looking at feeder school patterns and how we can separate out that.
Perfect.
Zach, I had a quick clarification question, and Nikki made me think of it. What do you suppose will be the impact on the September 20th count day for this fall, given that we are projecting low, but not being able to know exactly what happens until it actually does happen? What do you see the impact on that count day being on our decisions here in that timeline?
As far as getting kids into schools, I don't know that the boundary committee is going to impact how many kids are coming back to schools, or how we rearrange boundaries or anything like that. And so our September 20 count, we're encouraging as many kids to come back. I think what really is going to influence it are those policies moving forward and how comfortable they feel with our policies of the safety of the buildings and capacity of the buildings, and being able to space out and things like that. But I don't know that necessarily this will impact the September 20 count.
I guess what I'm trying to ask, like more deeply, is I guess I'm concerned about making a decision this summer necessarily, and then if we may not come to that decision quickly, and maybe
So,
I'm projecting.
Yeah, Megan, we only have one meeting. There's no way we'll come to a decision this summer.
Okay,
I mean,
never mind.
we have one meeting with scenarios. July, we typically don't meet. August, you would start back up. And based off the multiple scenarios that Zach is going to share, it's going to take us a couple of meetings to get through all of those scenarios. So don't consume yourself about the decision making. That's why I said ideally you'll have some sort of recommendation by December, January-ish, somewhere in there. But because we wouldn't have even have had the step to go and educate the communities impacted and that kind of thing. Like there are lots of steps in between before a decision is made. And then the board would have to vote in approval. Are there any other questions? So we'll bring back the scenarios and then work our way through as many as possible at the next meeting and gather any questions or information from those scenarios. But based on the number, I would imagine we may get through 2, maybe 3, just depending on that's like been optimistic, just depending on the questions around, and that's okay because we would want to vet them and answer all the questions that we can. If there are no more questions about that, does anybody have any questions about the historical information that was sent out? Or is there other information? We gathered as much information as we could, and you may have asked for information that we may or may not be able to get, but just any questions about any of the information that was requested, but it's always available as a resource.
This is Carol Cadu Blackwood. I've been out of the loop, but has there been any information out to the public about your replacement for the next fall?
There's a current position posted. I said by the time we meet next time, I'm assuming we should have a replacement.
Will be missed.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, I will not keep anyone any longer. I value and respect your time, and we'll put together some of these scenarios. If there's any information we can send out in advance so that, I mean, you can see the physical stuff, but I'm not trying to create more work for Zach, because Zach actually does the job of 5 people. But if there are like a couple of scenarios that we can put out and say, if you do this, just like in a written form or something you can click on, we'll try to send that to you in advance so that you're not seeing it for the first time here. Thank you.
Wait, can you just repeat the date of the next meeting?
It is June 17th, I believe. Yes, June 17th.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.